Got a minute or two? We have a way to make it not okay. Welcome to Sinister Minutes. I'm your host, writer and storyteller, Kurt Homer. Next to me is the master of macabre musical musings, the maestro of mood, Tim Parker. Together, let us take you on a journey into the dark heart of disturbing. Sinister Minutes. It's not okay. Sinister Minutes features tales that include disturbing content. That's intentional, because like the podcast itself, the creators here at Sinister Minutes are really not okay. Content featured on this podcast may include descriptions of abuse, addiction, alcohol, blood, bodily fluids, bondage, bones, bullying, burning, cancer, cannibalism, cheating, clowns, coma, confinement, control, cults, death, decapitation, depression, diets, divorce, domestic abuse, drowning, drugs, dying, eating disorders, epidemics, experimentation, family conflict, fear, fighting, fire, gaslighting, ghosts, gore, guns, harassment, hate crimes, hazing, homelessness, homicide, hospitalization, hostage situation, hostile work environments, illness, incarceration, infidelity, injury, institutionalization, kidnapping, manipulation, medical procedures, memory problems, mental health issues, military service, misogyny, murder, mutilation, needles, nightmares, nudity, pain, panic attacks, paralysis, physical abuse, pornography, physical assault, police brutality, poverty, profanity, religion, robbery, scars, screaming, self-harm, smoking, aches, spiders, stabbing, stalking, starvation, substance abuse, suicide, terrorism, threats, torture, victim blaming, violence, war, weapons, weather, and maybe, just maybe, witches. Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Sinister Minutes podcast. Thank you, as always, for listening and for telling your friends about us. The real ones, and the ones whose voices you hear coming up through the pipes in the bathroom in the wee hours of the night. If you like us, please leave us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. That way, we get to meet even more of you. We drop new episodes every other Friday because you lovely people continue to inspire us. But this feels so one-sided. Please, we'd love to hear from you, so look for us on Facebook under Sinister Minutes, or just reach out to us via sinisterminutes@gmail.com. Today's episode of Sinister Minutes is a tale set in the haunting humidity of New Orleans, a city so steeped in myth and legend that we hesitated to try adding another one to the list. What the hell? We have few boundaries and fewer filters, so today we're presenting Bayou Gold for your listening pleasure. A legend of buried treasure, An unscrupulous, big, easy businessman, an old Cajun running a boat through the swamps. What more could you ask for? Rest assured, Tim and I are not abandoning our lovely listeners for a life at sea. But I've gotta say, a peg leg and a hook do look mighty enticing to the likes of those who are not okay. Bayou Gold, written and narrated by Kurt Homan. Darryl LaRue normally avoided Bourbon Street. The hucksters, street performers, and grifters plying their trades for crowds of gawking tourists made for the worst of the quarter. But the Clover Grill had some damn good grub. He stared at the brass rod in the center of the laminate table, where the man across from him had just placed it. 2 fingers in diameter, half as long as his forearm. He picked it up, turned it, studied the deep grooves and notches that covered its surface. It was heavier than it looked. "Can I get y'all anything else?" The server stood at the ready, a name tag labeled Gem pinned crookedly to her striped apron, faded from too many wash cycles. Both men shook their heads and pushed their empty plates towards her. When she was a few paces away, Darryl swung the object at Bob like he meant to strike him with it. "Now just what the hell is this supposed to be?" Bob replied, his voice a mix of southern gent with a splash of backwater Cajun. "It's exactly what I promised you. All the wealth you can imagine. Gold, jewelry, there's the key to a pirate's treasure." For a man over 80, Bob Appleby was in decent shape. Tall and thin, only the spots on his hands and bald head gave any real indication of his age. Darryl felt the need to suck in his gut around Bob. He was half the other man's age and had twice the punch around his waist. Darryl also knew he held all the cards. "Quit the bullshit, old man. This piece of junk ain't gonna cover that for that weed farm of yours." "Hardly a weed farm. It's a sanctuary for rare plants, specifically Sarracenia, pitcher plants." Darryl wasn't going to miss working with Bob. Cutting deals, greasing palms, that stuff was all part of a day's work. Listening to an old man drone on about things that interested only him wasn't worth his time. "I don't care about—" "Do you know how a pitcher plant works?" continued Bob. "It sets out all the things a fly might enjoy. Pretty colors, exotic smells. When that old fly comes to check things out, well, it gets—" Okay. Darryl's patience was running low. He felt the heat rise in his face. "Whatever. Thanks for the botany lesson. But as for this—" Bob tapped the end of the metal rod that Darryl still held. "It's far from junk. Why, that thing's older than both of us put together." Darryl's grip on the brass was tight enough to turn his knuckles white. He'd pulled his share of cons, and this damn well felt like one aimed squarely at him. "Just 'cause it's old," he said, his words clipped, "don't mean it ain't junk." He leaned forward, glaring at the other man. "What's this scrap metal got to do with treasure? How's it going to pay what you owe me?" Bob reached into the satchel he'd set up in his lap and withdrew a thin notebook that he slid across the table. "Everything you need is right here. I know you don't believe me. Shoot, I don't blame you. But I'll tell you what, take yourself a week. Check it out. If it's not everything I told you, well, you just give me back that key and I'll cut you a check. All the money I owe you, plus a little extra for your time. 180 sound fair to you?" "A week?" Darryl was done screwing around. "Enough time for you to skip town, eh? Tell you what, 200,000 by Friday, or your little weed farm gets paved over." Bob's smile never wavered. "Mr. LaRue, once you've checked it all out, I'd be very surprised if you even want to see me come Friday. He rose to his feet, reached across the table, and shook Daryl's hand. Once Bob was out the door, Daryl allowed his gut to roll over the top of his belt and shook his head. He'd been so eager to be rid of the old man, he'd let him slip out and stick him with the tab. It would get added to the bill. He opened the notebook. It had to be a con. Why would Bob just hand it to him if what was written in the pages was true? But if it was just a story, the man had done some homework to back it up. The notebook was stuffed with photocopied maps and diary entries, some in English, some in French, some indecipherable. Everything was annotated in a meticulous script that Daryl assumed was Bob's. Daryl understood enough, and it all pointed to one thing: the big prize, the one that countless treasure hunters had been seeking for over 2 centuries. The location of the treasure of the notorious businessman, privateer, and pirate, Jean Lafitte. Part of him wanted to check it out right away, but he had other calls to make, people to meet, palms to grease. A deal maker like himself couldn't afford to upset the plans and goals of his clientele, even if he was sitting on what would be the biggest find of the century. If, he kept reminding himself, it was real. And if it was, why the hell would Bob be so willing to hand it over? It was past 10 when he arrived home. The house was dark and the silver Mercedes wasn't in the garage. Lizette had gone out for the evening. Again. He wondered who she was with this time, then pushed the thought out of his head. It was well past time to cut her loose. Over a late dinner of reheated gumbo, he stared at the notebook again, specifically at the picture that resembled the metal rod had propped in front of himself on the kitchen counter, and how it was to be used. He flipped open his laptop and started cross-checking the notes, adding more of his own. It didn't add up. Sure, Appleby had needed him to pull the right strings for his sanctuary, but in terms of payment, this was over the top. Why hadn't the old man just gone and collected it himself? If it wasn't a con, it was probably some kind of setup. Both cons and setups could be made to backfire. Daryl spent the next several hours in front of the computer, deciphering as much as he could of the notebook. It was almost dawn before he crawled into bed. Lizette still hadn't come home. All-night parties had become typical for her. By noon, Daryl was wide awake. It was still early springtime, but the Louisiana heat and humidity were coming on fast. He kicked up the AC. Lizette had crashed on the couch, black dress hiked up around her hips, blonde hair splayed around her head. Her mouth hung open, the loud snore telling a tale of another night of excess. Daryl shook his head and wondered how she had attracted him in the first place. She had a decent body, but he could certainly afford some better options. He spent the next 10 minutes on the phone, focusing on what he needed but revealing no more than he had to. The last call was to Bob. "I'm headed out there this afternoon." "You won't be disappointed," said Bob. "I assure you." "No need to assure me of anything. You're coming with." "You don't need me to." "I need you to be at your front door, ready to go in 1 hour." "I'm just going to slow you down." "No, you're not. You're going to make sure everything goes just right." Daryl hung up before the other man could come up with an excuse. 2 hours later, the airboat cruised through the bayou, wind and splashing water helping to cut the humidity. In the front, Daryl sat next to Billy. At 6'4", with the physique of a wrestler and an arsenal of weapons hidden on his person, Billy was his insurance policy. The man saw and heard everything, could move lightning fast when needed, and never questioned the guy paying his salary. The airboat belonged to Henri. He was an old Cajun guide who'd always lived in the bayous, and the locals said he had raised baby gators in his thick white beard. He didn't work cheap, but he knew the area and didn't trade in gossip. Darrell had gone over the map with Henri, who simply nodded and held out his three-fingered hand for payment. He steered the boat from the back and sat next to Bob, who gripped the arms of his seat and looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Guys like Billy and Henri were invaluable. Flat rates agreed to up front, no questions. Not about anything discovered during the job or anything that happened. Henri killed the engine when they reached the island, overgrown with cypress and long shrouds of Spanish moss. Without the wind created by the motion of the boat, the moist bayou atmosphere settled on them like a hot green blanket. With shovels and picks, Darrell, Billy, and Bob set out onto the island. Lafitte thankfully hadn't used trees as landmarks, figuring things would likely be different when he returned. He had marked off his map with paces, and once they'd established what a pace meant to the pirate, it took less than 20 minutes to find the spot they were looking for. A boulder taller than Billy and easily as wide lay in front of a steep crag. "Billy," Darrell pointed to the rock, "get that thing out of the way." Without so much as a raised eyebrow, Billy drove a long steel digging bar into the ground at the base of the stone and pushed. The thing was immense, yet the big man barely flexed a bicep before it rumbled a few feet to the right. The notebook had referenced a balanced stone that one man could move. So far, so good. The boulder had hidden a crevice. It looked just wide enough to admit a man of medium build. Billy would never fit. "Shit," Darrell turned to Bob. "Why don't you go first?" "Why, this is your treasure. Don't you want to be the one who—" "Billy, our friend needs a little encouragement." If it was a trap, Bob could be the one to spring it. If it was a con and there was no treasure, well, he and Bob would have a little chat about that. Billy nodded and took a step toward Bob. "Whoa!" Bob held up his hands. "I can go first." "I'll be right behind you," said Darrell, "so don't get any ideas." The two men squeezed into the fissure. At the first bend, Darrell got stuck. He strained to push forward, but the rock faces held him fast. He was able to turn his head enough to see the daylight from back the way he'd just come, then tried to move in that direction and found he couldn't do that either. Sweating in spite of the cooler air inside the cap, and embarrassed to call out, he pushed all the air from his chest and wriggled himself up and down. It was just enough, and he slipped forward with a gasp. The crevice opened wider after the bend, but the light was gone. Darrell reached for his phone, then thought better of it. If he dropped it, he'd never be able to bend over and pick it up. So he pushed along in the dark, hearing the other man breathing hard just ahead of him. Bob had come to a stop. "This must be the place. You have the key?" "Of course." Darrell felt the walls on either side of him, rough stone in every direction. Bob grabbed his hand and guided him until his fingers slipped into a hole. It had to be the keyway. "Well, let's see what you've led me to." Darrell slipped the brass key from his pocket and pushed it in. Nothing happened at first, but then a rumbling sound arose. Light poured over him, briefly blinding him after the pitch black. A doorway had opened in one of the rock faces, and they stood in a chamber the size of a double garage. Thousands of small holes in the rock ceiling dripped with moisture, but also admitted bright sunlight. It reflected on the objects covering the floor. Gold coins, jewelry, gemstones, some in what remained of rotting wooden chests, most scattered across the floor. Darrell started to step forward, then thought better of it. He grabbed Bob by the shoulders and shoved. The older man stumbled into the chamber without setting off any booby traps, so Darrell entered behind him. Dazzled, he picked up the first piece of his newfound wealth. The cold metal warmed to his touch. He looked closely at it, scratched it with his nail. He picked up a handful of coins, letting them slip through his fingers, listening to the clinking, True to pirate form, several skulls and numerous bones, some bleached by years under the filtered sun, lay scattered amongst the riches. In the center of the chamber, several courses of brick had been laid in a small circle, like the casing of a well. Darrell stepped closer to it, knelt down, and looked inside. Still water lay a few inches below ground level, but instead of his own reflection, the face Darrell saw peering back at him was Bob. What the... Feeling off kilter, he rose shakily and turned. There was no sign of the other man, nor of the exit. Solid rock hemmed him in on all sides. "Billy!" "You have my gratitude, Monsieur Leroux." A familiar voice, now with a distinctly French accent, emanated from the shallow well. Darrell pivoted back to the well as the voice continued. "The body I have left you, it is in decent shape, no?" In horror, Darrell raised his hands toward his face, stared at them, at the unfamiliar long, thin fingers, at the patchwork of age spots. "Billy!" The voice from the well said, "A pirate always keeps his word. The treasure I promised, it is yours. Enjoy it." "God damn you, Appleby!" screamed Darrell in a voice no longer his own. "Billy!" There was no response. The man who looked like Darrell Leroux emerged from the crevice a few minutes later. It had been a tight squeeze. He'd need to shed a few pounds before he brought anyone else to the treasure trove, but it would be years before that was necessary. Other than the paunch, he'd chosen well with Darrell. "Mon ami," he said to Billy, "if you should notice any small changes, I trust I can continue your discretion, yes?" As he spoke, he rubbed his thumb against his first two fingers in the universal money gesture. Billy nodded. He'd be loyal to any man who signed his checks, whatever his personal traits. Lisette would be equally persuaded. The old Mr. Leroux had not set a high bar regarding his treatment of those around him, and the new Mr. Leroux felt quite certain he'd be considerably more charming, especially since Lisette, over the past several months, had revealed something of herself while playing chess in Jackson Square with a charming elderly man she knew as Bob. Back in 1805, Jean Lafitte had discovered out in the Bayou a perfect place to hide his treasure. Only after he'd moved it into the island cave did the ancient swamp witch, or demon, or whatever she was, rise from the muck and demand payment of rent. She cared little for gold, preferring flesh and blood. He'd learned her abilities as well as her needs and brokered a deal. The gold and jewels, priceless by the standards of any generation, would remain in her realm. Collateral by which he was allowed to leave the island with his heart still beating, his lungs still drawing breath. It was a good bargain, and he'd made the first payment within a week's time. She was not greedy, and so every few decades he swapped to a more youthful body and a different life, leaving the old one for her to slowly savor. New Orleans had never failed to provide another greedy soul to feed her appetite. And so, over time, the city's history came to include a number of men who turned unexpectedly from greed to philanthropy. After all, a man who could assume the life and assets of another had little reason to ever hoard his own wealth. "I do think we're squared away." The transition was always awkward for the first few minutes, but Leroux's accent flowed more easily now. "Billy, roll that stone back, would you please? We wouldn't want anybody getting stuck back there." He patted his pocket and the brass key that it held. His other pocket contained the wallet and cell phone he'd easily lifted from a man fascinated by the allure of shining Bayou gold. Sinister Minutes is presented by Kurt Homan and Tim Parker. The musical score was composed and performed by Tim Parker. Our production team consists of Kurt Homan and Tim Parker. On behalf of everyone here at the Sinister Minutes podcast, namely Kurt Homan and Tim Parker, we thank you for listening, for joining us as we explore all the ways in which we are not okay. This audio program is copyright 2024 by Kurt Homan and Tim Parker under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.